The airplane was preparing for takeoff. Passengers were settling into their seats, some with eager smiles, others visibly exhausted. In the business class section, a young girl named Emily Carter sat by the window, gripping her boarding pass tightly. It was her first time flying alone, and the thrill mixed with nervous anticipation swirled in her chest. Her father, David Carter, the CEO of Sky Horizon Airlines, had surprised her with this ticket as a reward for her hard work in school. The spacious seat, the crisp white linens, the gentle hum of the engines, everything felt surreal. Until it didn't. The sharp clack of heels on the aisle carpet interrupted her thoughts. A flight attendant named Linda Thompson stopped by Emily's seat, her eyes scanning the girl from head to toe. Her lips tightened. "Miss," Linda's voice was firm, devoid of the warmth she'd used with other passengers. "I'm afraid you're in the wrong seat." Emily blinked and held up her ticket. "This is my seat," she said softly. Linda barely glanced at the ticket before shaking her head. "No, sweetie, business class is reserved for our premium passengers. You need to move to economy." Passengers nearby shifted in their seats, stealing glances but staying silent. Emily's heart raced. She double-checked her ticket. Seat 4A, business class. "But this is my seat," she repeated, her voice wavering. Linda's eyes narrowed. "I don't know how you got that ticket, but you don't belong here," she said, crossing her arms. "Get your things and move." Emily's face flushed with humiliation. She wanted to speak up, to defend herself, but the heat of Linda's stare and the uncomfortable silence from the surrounding passengers pinned her in place. With trembling hands, she grabbed her backpack and stood up. As she made the long walk to the back of the plane, she kept her eyes down, biting the inside of her cheek to stop the tears. She passed row after row of indifferent faces. One man in a suit gave her an apologetic glance but quickly looked away. No one said a word. When Emily reached the economy section, she slumped into a cramped middle seat. The contrast was stark. Narrow armrests, a broken screen on the seat back in front of her, and the faint smell of instant coffee. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve, trying to process what had just happened. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from her dad. "Everything okay?" Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She didn't want to worry him, but the knot of anger and embarrassment in her stomach demanded an outlet. She typed, "They made me move to economy, said I don't belong in business class." The reply came almost instantly. "Who made you move?" "A flight attendant," she answered. "What's the flight number?" Emily hesitated, then sent the information. Her father didn't respond right away. She pictured him sitting at his desk, jaw tightening as he read her message. In the front of the plane, Linda returned to her duties, adjusting pillows and serving drinks with a satisfied expression. She prided herself on maintaining the right atmosphere in business class. To her, Emily's presence had been an anomaly, something that needed correcting. Meanwhile, in the back of the plane, Emily clenched her phone and stared at the seat back in front of her. The humiliation lingered, but so did something else, the spark of her father's protective determination. The flight had only just begun, but Emily had a feeling the real turbulence was yet to come. Emily shifted in her cramped seat, her heart still racing. The memory of Linda Thompson's dismissive tone echoed in her mind. She stared at the darkened screen on the seat back in front of her, her thoughts swirling. How could something so simple, a valid ticket, turn into such a humiliating ordeal? Her phone vibrated again, pulling her back to the present. A new message from her dad appeared. "Stay calm, I'm handling it." The words should have brought comfort, but Emily wasn't sure what handling it really meant. She imagined her father sitting at his desk, eyebrows furrowed, phone pressed to his ear. David Carter was a calm, methodical man, but when it came to his daughter, he didn't tolerate injustice. Emily sighed and slid her phone back into her pocket. In the front of the cabin, Linda Thompson filled a tray with glasses of sparkling water, chatting with a businessman in 3B. She kept glancing toward the back of the plane with a self-satisfied smirk. To her, the situation was resolved. The unwanted passenger had been relocated, and the refined atmosphere of business class restored. But Linda didn't notice when the intercom above the galley crackled to life. "Miss Thompson, please report to the cockpit immediately." The captain's voice was calm but firm. Linda set down the tray, frowning. Calls to the cockpit mid-flight were unusual. She straightened her uniform and walked to the front. In the cockpit, Captain Mark Reynolds was seated, his eyes fixed on the communication panel. The co-pilot gave Linda a quick glance but said nothing. The captain turned toward her, his expression serious. "Miss Thompson," he began, We've received a communication from the airline's headquarters. Linda's stomach tightened. Headquarters? The captain nodded and tapped the screen of the communication monitor. The face of David Carter appeared. His expression was composed, but his eyes were cold. "Mr. Carter," Linda stammered, instinctively smoothing her uniform. "Miss Thompson," David said, his voice low. "You removed my daughter from her assigned seat." Linda's breath caught. "Sir, there must have been a misunderstanding. I was just following protocol." "Protocol?" David's tone sharpened. "Did you check the passenger manifest before removing her?" Linda froze. She hadn't. She'd acted on instinct and assumption. The silence stretched uncomfortably. "I'm giving you a direct order," David continued. "Return my daughter to her seat immediately and apologize, in front of the passengers." Linda's jaw tightened, but she forced a nod. "Yes, sir." The screen went dark. Captain Reynolds turned to Linda. "You heard him." Linda left the cockpit with stiff steps. As she walked back through the aisle, the carefree smile she'd worn earlier was gone. Passengers noticed the shift in her demeanor, sensing that something significant was happening. Reaching the economy section, Linda stopped next to Emily's seat. The girl looked up, surprise and confusion flickering across her face. Linda cleared her throat. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice loud enough for surrounding passengers to hear, "I need to apologize. I made a mistake in asking you to move. Your seat is in business class. Please come with me." The rows around them went silent. Emily hesitated, then grabbed her backpack and stood. As she followed Linda down the aisle, heads turned, eyes tracking their every step. The same passengers who'd ignored her humiliation earlier now watched with curiosity and unease. When Emily reached her seat in business class, Linda helped her stow her bag. "If you need anything," she said, forcing a smile, "just let me know." Emily settled into her seat, but the satisfaction she expected didn't come. The injustice hadn't disappeared, it had just shifted. She glanced at the other passengers, wondering how many of them would have spoken up if her father hadn't intervened. The cabin crew resumed their duties, but the atmosphere felt different now. The unspoken rules of privilege and prejudice had been exposed, and no amount of polished service could smooth it over. Back in the galley, Linda gripped the counter with white-knuckled hands. Her career had just been placed under a spotlight, and the turbulence was far from over. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but the tension among the passengers was palpable. Emily Carter sat rigidly in her business class seat, her heart still beating faster than usual. The humiliation of being forced to move to economy was fresh, but the walk back through the cabin under the gaze of curious strangers left an even deeper scar. She pulled out her phone and saw another message from her father. "Proud of you. Stay strong. We'll talk when you land." She inhaled deeply and looked around. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a suit gave her an awkward smile. She recognized him as one of the passengers who'd watched her earlier ordeal in silence. He quickly averted his gaze. In the galley, Linda Thompson stared at her reflection in a metal cabinet. The usually pristine uniform felt heavy, the authority she'd once worn like armor now hanging loosely on her shoulders. The pilot's words echoed in her mind. "Did you check the passenger manifest?" She hadn't. Linda had prided herself on her ability to read people quickly, but this time, she'd made a mistake, a costly one. Her thoughts were interrupted by a fellow flight attendant, Sarah Miller, who entered the galley with a frown. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked. Linda straightened. "Fine, just dealing with a situation." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "That situation is all over the cabin. People are talking, and the captain just radioed in. Headquarters is involved." Linda's stomach dropped. "What did they say?" "They want a full report as soon as we land," Sarah said, lowering her voice. "And Mr. Carter himself is meeting the plane." The weight of those words settled heavily. Linda knew David Carter's reputation, fair but unforgiving when it came to professionalism. She glanced toward the cabin, catching a glimpse of Emily sitting quietly, fingers tapping her phone. The girl didn't look triumphant, she looked exhausted. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts." The cabin buzzed with passengers adjusting seats and gathering belongings, but conversations about the earlier incident continued in hushed tones. Emily fastened her belt and stared out the window at the city lights below. She thought about the passengers who'd witnessed her humiliation. Why hadn't anyone said anything? Were they too shocked, too indifferent, or just unwilling to get involved? She remembered her father telling her once, "Silence in the face of wrongdoing isn't neutrality, it's complicity." The landing was smooth, but the atmosphere remained charged. As the plane taxied to the gate, Emily's phone buzzed. "I'm here. Wait for me at the gate." Her father's calm presence always made her feel safe, but this time, she sensed the storm beneath the surface. The plane came to a halt, and the seatbelt sign switched off. Passengers stood and stretched, but their curiosity kept their movements slow. Emily gathered her bag and moved toward the exit. Linda Thompson stood by the door, her face pale but professional. "Have a nice evening, Miss Carter," Linda said, voice tight. Emily gave a curt nod and walked past without a word. As she stepped into the jet bridge, she spotted her father at the far end. David Carter stood with his hands clasped in front of him, flanked by two senior airline executives. His eyes softened when he saw Emily, and he opened his arms. She rushed into his embrace. "You okay?" he asked, holding her tightly. "Yeah," she mumbled into his chest. "Just tired." David kissed the top of her head, then straightened. His expression hardened as he turned toward the airplane door. Linda appeared moments later, her steps hesitant. "Miss Thompson," David greeted her, his tone even. "Mr. Carter," she answered, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. "Walk with me," he said. Without waiting for a response, he turned and strode toward the terminal. Linda followed, her heart racing. Emily watched them go. Her father's shoulders were squared, his stride purposeful. Linda's were hunched slightly, her steps uneven. Emily knew that conversation wouldn't be easy, and she couldn't help but wonder if Linda would finally admit what she'd known all along. She judged Emily not by her ticket, but by her appearance. As they disappeared into a private office, Emily sat down in a nearby chair and pulled out her phone. The messages poured in from friends who'd seen social media posts about the incident. One message stood out. "Proud of you for staying strong. Some battles aren't fair, but the right people will always stand with you." Emily smiled faintly. The journey wasn't over, but she'd already learned one lesson. When faced with injustice, silence is never the right response. The walls of the airport's private office were painted a dull beige, the kind of neutral color that blurred into the background. David Carter sat at the head of a sleek glass-topped table, his expression unreadable. Across from him sat Linda Thompson, her posture stiff, her palms flat on the table to hide the tremble in her fingers. The door closed with a soft click as the airline's HR director, Rachel Stevens, entered and took a seat beside David. David broke the silence. "Miss Thompson, we're here to understand why my daughter, who had a valid business class ticket, was removed from her seat." Linda's throat went dry. I made a mistake, sir." Rachel Stevens adjusted her glasses. "What kind of mistake?" Linda's eyes dropped to the table. "I assumed she was in the wrong seat. I didn't check the manifest." David's fingers tapped against the table's surface. "Why did you assume she didn't belong there?" The question hit like a sledgehammer. Linda opened her mouth, but no words came. She'd trained for years to handle difficult situations in the air, to manage emergencies and mediate conflicts. But now, in the stillness of this office, she faced a crisis of her own making. David leaned forward, his voice softer but no less firm. "When you saw my daughter, a teenager, traveling alone, you didn't see a passenger with a valid ticket. You saw someone who, in your mind, didn't fit the profile of a business-class traveler." Linda flinched. "It wasn't personal," she whispered. "That's the problem," David said. "These assumptions happen too often, and they cause real harm." The room went quiet. Linda knew he was right. She'd acted on a snap judgment, one she'd made many times before without consequence, until now. Meanwhile, outside the office, Emily sat on a bench scrolling through her phone. News of the incident had spread online, and comments flooded her notifications. "Poor kid," one read. "Good for her dad for standing up." Another, "Happens all the time, just usually without consequences." She locked her phone and leaned back against the wall. The weight of the incident pressed down on her. It wasn't just about her anymore. People she didn't even know were sharing their own stories of being judged unfairly while traveling. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "The true test of character is what you do after the mistake." Back in the office, Rachel Stevens pulled out a folder and placed it in front of Linda. "We're suspending you effective immediately," she said. "You'll be required to complete bias awareness training and undergo a performance review before returning to active duty." Linda's face turned pale. "I understand," she murmured. David stood. "This isn't about punishing you for one mistake. It's about making sure it doesn't happen again, to anyone." He left the room, Rachel following behind. Linda remained seated, her hands now clenched together. Her career hadn't ended, but it dangled by a thread. Outside the office, David spotted Emily and walked over. "Hey, kiddo," he said, sitting beside her. "Is it over?" she asked. "The meeting is," David replied, "but the work isn't. What happens now?" "The airline will change some policies, more training, more accountability, and hopefully fewer people will have to go through what you did." Emily leaned against his shoulder. "I don't get it. Why would she assume I didn't belong there?" David sighed. "Sometimes people rely on outdated ideas without realizing it. It's wrong, but it happens. What's important is how we respond when it does." Emily thought about that as they walked toward the exit. Her humiliation had sparked something bigger than herself. She wasn't just a passenger who'd been mistreated. She was now part of a much-needed conversation about fairness in the skies. As they stepped into the cool night air, she realized this flight had changed her forever. The morning after the incident, the Sky Horizon headquarters buzzed with activity. Employees whispered in corridors, emails circulated with subject lines like PR crisis and urgent policy review. David Carter sat in his office reviewing the growing list of media inquiries. The story of his daughter's mistreatment had spread far beyond the usual travel blogs. Major news outlets were picking it up, turning it into a wider conversation about discrimination in air travel. David's phone buzzed. It was Rachel Stevens. "The training programs are scheduled," she said without preamble. "We've partnered with a DEI consulting firm. Sessions start next month for all flight attendants." "Good," David replied. "And Linda Thompson?" "She's agreed to the training," Rachel said, reluctantly. David leaned back in his chair. "We'll see if she learns from it. Keep me posted." He ended the call and glanced at a framed photo on his desk. Emily, age 5, grinning in a toy plane cockpit. He smiled faintly, then turned to his next task. Meanwhile, Emily sat at the kitchen table at home, scrolling through her phone. Messages poured in from strangers, some supportive, others skeptical. "Must be nice to have a dad who owns the airline," one comment read. Another said, "Kids these days are too sensitive." She felt a pang of frustration. Her dad walked in with 2 mugs of cocoa. "Mind if I join you?" She pushed her phone aside. "People are saying I overreacted." David sipped his cocoa. "You didn't, but when you speak out, some people get uncomfortable." "Why?" "Because admitting there's a problem means admitting things need to change, and change is hard." Emily mulled that over. "So what do I do?" "Keep telling the truth, and remember, you're helping more people than you're upsetting." Later that day, Linda Thompson sat alone in a training room at the airport. A projector displayed words across the wall: "Unconscious bias in aviation." The facilitator, a no-nonsense woman named Karen Lee, walked in and gave Linda a curt nod. "Ready to get uncomfortable?" Karen asked. Linda forced a smile. "I guess." Karen sat beside her. "Let's start with what happened on Flight 247. Linda's stomach nodded. "I assumed Emily Carter was in the wrong seat." "Why?" Linda hesitated. "She didn't look like the usual business class passenger." Karen jotted notes. "That assumption led to her removal despite a valid ticket." "What do you think the impact was?" Linda shifted in her seat. "Humiliation, distrust, anger." "Exactly," Karen said. "Now let's dig into why you made that assumption." 2 hours later, Linda left the session with a pounding headache and a notebook full of uncomfortable truths. She'd always prided herself on professionalism, but now she saw how deeply some biases had influenced her decisions. Outside, she saw Sarah Miller, her coworker, waiting. "How was it?" Sarah asked. "Tough," Linda admitted, "but necessary." Across town, David and Emily sat in a conference room at the local news station, preparing for a live interview. The producer adjusted Emily's microphone. "Nervous?" David asked. "A little," she said, "but I want people to understand what happened." When the cameras rolled, the anchor smiled warmly. "Emily, can you tell us what you felt when the flight attendant asked you to move?" Emily took a deep breath. "I felt invisible. Like my ticket didn't matter because of how I looked." "And what do you want to see change?" the anchor asked. "I want airlines to treat everyone the same," Emily said. "No assumptions, just fairness." The interview ended, and as they left the studio, David squeezed her hand. "You did great, kiddo." The next morning, the airline announced a new Passenger First initiative requiring all employees to complete annual diversity training. Emily read the announcement online and smiled. Change was coming, slowly but surely, and she'd helped make it happen. The days following the airline's announcement of the Passenger First initiative were a whirlwind of media coverage, internal meetings, and customer feedback. Emily Carter returned to school trying to adjust to the sudden attention. Her classmates whispered as she passed, and some even asked for selfies, calling her the girl who changed the skies. Emily smiled politely but felt uncomfortable with the label. She hadn't set out to change anything, she just wanted to sit in her assigned seat without being questioned. Meanwhile, David Carter sat in the boardroom of Sky Horizon Airlines addressing the executive team. "We can't let this be a one-time fix," he said, his voice firm. "Bias doesn't disappear with one round of training. We need to track complaints, monitor patterns, and take action." Rachel Stevens, the HR director, nodded. "We've set up an anonymous reporting system. Employees and passengers can report concerns without fear of retaliation." David gave a satisfied nod, then checked his phone. A text from Emily. "Can we talk tonight? Need advice?" He quickly replied, "Of course." That evening, they sat on the living room couch, wrapped in blankets and sipping cocoa. "What's on your mind?" David asked. "I've been getting messages," Emily said, scrolling through her phone. "Some people say I'm brave, others think I'm just a spoiled kid with a powerful dad." David sighed. "People project their own issues onto others. You spoke up about something real. Not everyone will like that." "But what if I made it worse?" she whispered. "Worse?" David's eyebrows lifted. "Since your story went public, we've had hundreds of messages from passengers who've experienced the same thing. You didn't make it worse, Em. You made it visible." She rested her head on his shoulder. "I just want people to feel like they belong." "Then you're already doing the right thing." Across town, Linda Thompson sat in front of her laptop, scrolling through the airline's internal portal. The Passenger First initiative dominated the homepage, with her name notably absent from the list of employees recognized for their contributions. Her suspension remained in effect, but she'd received an email earlier that day. Mandatory follow-up assessment scheduled. Linda clicked the link and saw the date, 2 days away. Her pulse quickened. The training sessions had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths, but the prospect of being evaluated on those lessons terrified her. Failure could mean termination. The day of the assessment arrived. Linda sat in a small, windowless conference room across from Karen Lee, the same facilitator who'd led her first session. "Linda," Karen began, "this isn't just about reciting policies. It's about demonstrating genuine change." Linda nodded. "I get that. I do." Karen's gaze was steady. "Let's start with a scenario. A passenger in first class doesn't fit your mental picture of who should be there. What do you do?" Linda clasped her hands tightly. "I'd check the manifest first. Every time. No assumptions. And if the ticket is valid, then they're exactly where they belong," Linda answered. "And I'd welcome them like anyone else." Karen's lips curved into a slight smile. "Good. Let's continue." 2 hours later, Linda left the conference room, her shoulders lighter. She wasn't proud of what she'd done on Flight 247, but she'd faced it. Now she had a chance to move forward. That night, Emily checked her phone one last time before bed. A notification popped up. Sky Horizon introduces Open Skies Youth Program. She opened the article and read aloud. "The program will provide mentorship and career pathways for young people interested in aviation, focusing on inclusivity and accessibility." She ran to her dad's office. "Did you see this?" David smiled. "I might have heard something about it." Emily grinned. For the first time since the flight, she felt something shift. The humiliation still lingered, but now it stood beside something stronger: hope. The weeks that followed brought both progress and pressure. Emily Carter found herself navigating a new normal. Her peers, once indifferent, now treated her like a minor celebrity. Teachers referenced her experience during lessons on social justice. Even the local newspaper ran a story: "Teen Advocates for Fair Skies." Emily appreciated the recognition, but part of her longed to go back to simply being the quiet girl who loved science and aviation. Her father, David Carter, was equally consumed. The airline's Passenger First initiative was officially launched, complete with workshops, feedback sessions, and a new slogan: "Every seat counts." David knew policies could change operations, but culture took time. He often stayed late at the office, sifting through passenger feedback that ranged from supportive to dismissive. Linda Thompson, meanwhile, stood at the threshold of her second chance. After passing her follow-up assessment, she'd been reinstated, but not as a senior flight attendant. She now worked the check-in counters, where she faced passengers head-on every day. The demotion stung, but Linda recognized it as an opportunity to rebuild her reputation. She noticed herself pausing more often, double-checking names, and offering warm welcomes to passengers she might once have dismissed. One afternoon, Linda saw a familiar face in the departure hall, Emily Carter, standing beside her father near a Sky Horizon information desk. Linda's pulse quickened. She adjusted her blazer and walked over. "Mr. Carter," she greeted, voice steady but heart racing. "Miss Carter?" Emily looked up and gave a polite nod. "Hi," she said, voice neutral. Linda cleared her throat. "I wanted to say, I've been doing a lot of learning since that flight. I can't erase what happened, but I'm working to make sure it never happens again." Emily studied her for a moment. "I hope you mean that," she replied softly. "I do," Linda said, "and if you ever need help at the airport, you can count on me." Emily gave a small, tight smile and turned away. David gave Linda a curt nod and followed his daughter toward the gate. Later, at the gate area, Emily sat watching planes taxi across the tarmac. "Dad," she said, "do you think she can really change?" "I don't know," David admitted. "People can surprise you, for better or worse. What matters is what they do next." As the boarding call echoed overhead, Emily looked out the window, her reflection merging with the distant image of a plane lifting into the sky. The journey wasn't over, but she'd learned that sometimes the hardest battles lead to the clearest skies. The sun dipped below the horizon as the Carter family arrived at the Sky Horizon Gala, an event marking the airline's new Open Skies program. Emily smoothed her dress and glanced around the grand terminal, now transformed into a glittering hall with banners that read, "Inclusion takes flight." Her father gave her a reassuring nod as cameras flashed. Inside, speeches highlighted the airline's journey toward inclusivity. David Carter took the stage to thank employees and passengers for their feedback. "True change requires more than policy," he said, his voice carrying across the hall. "It demands reflection, accountability, and the courage to admit when we're wrong." The crowd applauded. Emily stood near the refreshment table, fiddling with a napkin. She was proud of the changes but weary of being the face of it all. Just then, Linda Thompson appeared beside her. "Evening, Miss Carter," Linda greeted softly. "Hi," Emily replied, surprised. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I volunteered," Linda said, gesturing to the badge on her blazer. "Figured if I want to be part of the change, I should start by showing up." Emily nodded. "Showing up matters." Linda hesitated, then extended her hand. Emily shook it. The handshake, once unimaginable, felt like the closing of one chapter and the tentative beginning of another. The evening wound down and David and Emily headed home. In the car, David said, "I saw you talking with Linda." "Yeah," Emily answered. "She seemed different." "Sometimes," David said, "people really do change when given the chance." Emily pondered that as they pulled into their driveway. Her phone buzzed with a notification. A viral video of a passenger thanking Sky Horizon staff for their kindness and professionalism. The comments were filled with stories of improved experiences. "Looks like it's working," she said. David smiled, one flight at a time. Weeks later, Emily boarded a plane alone for the first time since the incident. As she settled into her seat, a flight attendant approached. "Miss Carter, just wanted to welcome you aboard." Emily tensed for a moment, but then saw the warmth in the woman's eyes. "Thank you," she said, returning the smile. The plane taxied to the runway, and Emily stared out the window as the city lights blurred beneath them. She thought about fear, about growth, and about how sometimes the skies that once felt hostile could become familiar again. As the plane leveled off, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. Our journey today is about more than reaching a destination. It's about the connections we build along the way." Emily smiled, recognizing the voice. It was Linda Thompson. The flight attendant who once judged her now piloted her journey. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of irony. Emily settled back into her seat, heart lighter than it had been in months. Sometimes, she realized, life's turbulence leads you exactly where you need to go.